Good evening, friends, and welcome. Whether you're joining us here in person or joining us online, we're just thrilled and happy to have you here tonight. My name is Bill Harmer. I'm the Executive Director of the Westport Library. And tonight, I'm just thrilled to have the honor to welcome you to an inspiring program about a life of determination and passion for making a change for the better despite your age. The story begins with our guest this evening, Will Haskell. He is here to discuss his new book, 100,000 First Bosses, My Unlikely Path as a 22-year-old Lawmaker. 100,000 First Bosses is the story of how one 20-something candidate for the state senate organized a campaign that literally captured the imagination of a nation and proved that his generation is ready to claim a seat at the table. When Will kicked off his campaign in the spring of his senior year of college, he was an unknown college student running for office against a popular incumbent who'd been in office for over 2 decades. Although he didn't have any professional experience at the time, he did bring forward a powerful message that resonated with voters. There's no minimum age to being on the right side of history. And so just a few months after graduating from college, he and his roommate, churned campaign manager, unseated a Republican candidate who'd been in the legislature for longer than Will had been alive. Their campaign activated an army of young volunteers who were energized by his message, and together they led a successful effort to transform government from the bottom up. As a state senator, Will was elected to represent 7 towns, including his hometown of Westport, in the Connecticut State Senate. In the Senate, he served as the chair of the Transportation Committee and the vice chair of the Government Administration and Elections Committee. He spent his first term in office focusing on affordable transportation improvements and voter rights. And in 2019, he helped create Connecticut's free community college program so that every high school student has an opportunity to pursue a degree. His labors have made it possible for students to graduate from community colleges to find good jobs in Connecticut without being in debt. There we go, I'm back. His other proud accomplishments include passing the most inclusive paid family and medical leave act program in the country, spearheading efforts to invest in our transportation infrastructure, raise the minimum wage, legalize cannabis, as well as enact one of the strongest gun laws in the country. Through the pandemic, yes. Throughout the pandemic, he and his team have worked hard to keep Connecticut residents safe, healthy, and protected, first by delivering groceries and prescriptions, then by helping to get folks vaccinated. I believe that Will would probably tell you that he ran for office because he thought his community needed a change and believes government works best when new voices have a chance to shape public policy. With that in mind, he thinks that the 26th district is ready for a new voice and has announced that he will not be running for re-election this year. Instead, he has decided to return to college to earn his law degree. I, for one, cannot wait to see what this man does next. Joining Will in conversation is our dear friend and library supporter, Jay Schadler. Jay is a 2-time Emmy Award-winning journalist, artist, and keynote speaker. For more than 3 decades as a correspondent and anchor, he traveled the world reporting stories for ABC News, 2020, Good Morning America, Nightline, and National Geographic. He's tracked tigers in India. He's hunted for the source of the Ebola virus in the rainforests of Africa. He returned to the Titanic with explorer Bob Ballard and hitchhiked 20,000 miles across America to have conversations with everyday Americans. In the words of Oprah Winfrey, Jay has the eyes of a journalist and the heart of a storyteller. We could not be more delighted to have Jay joining us again this evening on our stage in conversation with Will. Gentlemen, I'll let you take it away.
I'd say that just about does it, doesn't it?
I want to interview you, Jay.
For
Can we switch roles tonight? I want to hear about the Tigers and the Titanic.
Not tonight. Thank you so much for coming. He took a lot. My first question actually had to do with running for an office that had not had a Democrat for 50 years and an incumbent who had been in office longer than you've been alive. I had that as a first question. So Bill took that away from us. So we'll jump somewhere else. I love the bit in your book where you're still in college and you're telling your girlfriend, Katie, you're now going to be engaged to, right?
Yeah, my fiance now.
Katie says to you, you've just told her, I'm going to run for office. And she says to you, don't you think they can find someone more qualified? Respond to that. Would you tell her?
Katie was right to ask the question, as she always is. Yeah, people assume, I think, that all incumbents are challenged in every election, and that might be true for the President of the United States and almost every U.S. Senator, but when you get farther down on the ballot, you come across a lot of folks who have grown quite comfortable in the seats that they sit in. And I think that a lot of the general public seems to think that those seats belong to the folks who occupy them, when in fact, that seat in the Senate belonged to whomever decided to show up on Election Day. So I ran not because I thought that winning was probable. I wasn't even entirely convinced at that time that it was possible, but I did think that there's a value in the democratic process in asking incumbents to defend their voting record. I had to run for re-election in 2020, and it's a hassle. You go and knock on thousands and more doors, and you have to, your feet are held to the fire, but that's a really healthy thing. And even before I knew that the 26th district had a chance of going blue, I thought that it would be a good and healthy process to run this race, even if I didn't think we were going to win. And Katie eventually agreed.
I guess you did. First time you ran, 2018. There was a lot of anti-Trump sentiment in the country. There were strong voting blocks of young and suburban moms coming out to vote Democratic. Today's a lot different. Do you think in this landscape, today's landscape, if you were running for the first time, would you win?
Hard to say. 2022 is going to be a really hard year for Democrats, and I certainly am not blind to the fact that we benefited both in 2018 and in 2020, my team and I, by the fact that these were years that folks were frustrated by what was happening in Washington. I mean, that was why I had run in the first place. I was so horrified by President Trump's victory that I decided to come back to my hometown. But ultimately, I think what won the race more than any national trend is the fact that we didn't take any vote for granted, and we went everywhere. Everybody goes to senior centers because seniors vote in high numbers, but we went to every high school classroom that we could as well. We filled our offices with beanbag chairs and filled those beanbag chairs with high school and middle school interns who weren't yet old enough to vote, but made it their extracurricular activity to stamp envelopes and to call voters. So I think if we worked just as hard, I mean, there will be an election in 2022. I hope that this seat stays blue, given my partisan leanings, and I think it's absolutely possible with enough work.
Do you think you would have won if you were running for the very first time this year?
In 22, it would have been a challenge. It would have been an entirely different race, and the issues we would be running on would be different. But yeah, I do think it's possible.
Let me ask you to go way back when you were young. Was there something that that's true. You're so old now. When you were really young, was there something that triggered you about politics? Something that was very positive that you saw or felt that inspired you?
Yeah, in the very start of the book, I talk about going to the New Hampshire primary with my dad.
Oh, that's right.
And seeing the democratic process on the ground floor. I mean, we're used to going to the dump here in Westport and you see local candidates shaking hands and handing out flyers. But when you go to Exeter, New Hampshire, and you go to their dump, you're going to see a, candidate for president of the United States doing those same activities. You get to sit in living rooms with Hillary Clinton. You get to have a cup of coffee with John McCain and his wife. And you get to meet a young, inspiring senator named Barack Obama, who everybody was writing off because he didn't have enough experience. That, to me, was an eye-opening weekend that I spent up in New Hampshire. And it made me realize that I wanted to go into politics later on. I didn't expect to run for office right after graduation, but I knew that it was the reason I went to school in D.C., and it was something that had sort of really appealed to me from that first weekend.
Must have been a double thrill then when he endorsed you.
That was the craziest day ever. I think that
I had that down here as a question. What was the craziest day ever?
Yeah, we're checking off your questions left and right. Yeah, I think people imagine that when you get endorsed by the President of the United States that like there was a long, drawn-out process.
Yeah.
And just the opposite is true. We were sitting in our office, which is, it's now an Indian restaurant in Westport, but it was an abandoned Chinese restaurant at the time. And we were sitting in those beanbag chairs that I mentioned doing debate prep. And I got a call from a guy in Hartford who said, hey, in about an hour, you're going to be endorsed by President Obama. And it lent a credibility to our campaign that just wasn't there. A lot of people scoffed when a 21-year-old knocked on their door who was younger than their kids or younger than their grandkids.
Absolutely.
And all of a sudden, to have the president's name associated with the campaign, it was a huge boost.
Was that a pro forma sort of thing, or did he ever actually call or something?
He never called. Or I missed it if he did.
That would have been a mistake.
No.
You know, one of the things you talk about a lot is door-to-door campaigning. It sounds like you got to be pretty good at that. I'm curious about that on a number of levels. First of all, one of the things that you said was that door-to-door campaigning for you, it was not so much what they learned about you, it's what you learned about them, right?
That's exactly right. You know, there's a movement, I think, in Democratic politics at least, to say that door knocking is a thing of the past.
Yeah.
I think that that's a mistake for a few reasons. You can spend a lot of money on digital ads that make sure that your face shows up on everybody's iPhone, but that won't tell you anything about the folks that you're trying to represent. And when I went out door knocking, there's good and bad to door knocking, right? If there's a theme of this book, I hope that it's honesty. It's not a long campaign manifesto. It's not a stump speech. I want to give people a peek behind the curtain at the good, the bad, the ugly, and sometimes the funny of knocking doors and running for office. But I would start each of those conversations with a question. I'd introduce myself briefly and then say, what's the most important issue for you? And people would respond with all sorts of things. They were angry about the pothole at the end of their driveway or what was happening in the Oval Office. And state government falls somewhere in between those two extremes. But I learned what kept them up at night and eventually figured out how the state government could better serve them. And it made me a little bit better as a candidate. But more importantly, it made me a much better state senator when I had the chance to serve. Many of the ideas that I heard on front doors became bills, and those bills eventually became laws. And that's, I think, a healthy thing for the process. So for the cynics who say that door knocking is inefficient, it is. And for those who worry that they're going to get chased away by angry dogs, you will. But there's still a huge benefit, I think, to that exercise.
You make the observation that door-to-door campaigning for a woman or for a black woman in particular would be a very different thing.
Entirely different. Yeah, I talk in this book pretty candidly about the fact that we benefited from good timing, as you mentioned. We worked really hard, but we can't be blind to the fact that I had a million benefits as a young white man. Benefits that played out in big ways and in small ones. I talk about my friend Stephanie Thomas, state representative, representing Westport as well. And I learned one day that every time Stephanie went door to door, she brought a friend or a family member or a volunteer, because she is a woman of color, didn't feel safe wandering onto somebody's property unannounced. It was something that it was a fear that had never crossed my mind. And while I could go out and spend 6 hours door knocking all by myself without coordinating with anybody, she had to put in a little bit extra effort every time. There's another story I tell in the book. In New Canaan, I was in walking around downtown, and an older gentleman came up to me, and he said, hey, I'll be voting for you tomorrow. It was like right before Election Day. I'll be voting for you at the New Canaan High School. And I said, oh, that's actually a different precinct. My friend, Senator Alex Kasser, is running in that district. I hope you'll consider voting for her. She's wonderful. And he looked at me very sternly and said, no chicks. And it was a sort of blatant sexism that I had never experienced as a white guy. And I thought, how many people are voting for me, not because I knocked on their door, not because they agreed with my policy positions, but because I looked like their son or their grandson. How many country club types had been drawn to our campaign for that reason? So it's something that I still talk about a lot and try to think about, and hopefully through legislation we've tried to address and make it just a little bit easier for those other candidates, those other unlikely candidates, say, to run for office.
You know, you can imagine the advantages of running as a resident from Westport, obviously, where the annual income is $7 billion a year. Was there a disadvantage in any way running as a resident from Westport?
Well, first let me say, Westport was the town that took a chance on me. And looking out tonight, so many of you took a chance on me, and I'm so forever grateful for that.
And they're all masked,
Yeah.
every one of them. So
the challenge was going into 6 other towns, some of which I'd been to, but some of which I hadn't. So I remember I did like an hour-long interview with a reporter in Wilton, and she asked a bunch of policy questions that weren't a problem because I'd done my research, but then she ended with, well, what's your favorite place to eat in Wilton? It's like, oh my God, that's such a gotcha question, because I had no idea. You know?
Exactly. Do you know now?
Yeah, I do, Orem Steiner. But in all seriousness, it's a real challenge to get to know, and that's another benefit of door knocking, right? You learn where traffic builds up, you learn which intersections are dangerous when you go out door knocking, you get to know those communities a little bit better. So Westport's support for my campaign was critical because it was the largest town in the district, but also it allowed me to frankly spend a lot less time campaigning in Westport and a lot more time campaigning elsewhere.
If you, looking back at your 3 years now as a state senator, give me the sharpest and most accurate criticism that was leveled to you as a senator.
Tons of them. I think, so in the campaign,
Top 10.
On the campaign trail, we talk in terms of absolute rights and absolute wrongs. I'm absolutely right about this, and my opponent is absolutely wrong. Yeah. And governing is almost never like that. Occasionally, when we're voting on gun violence prevention or voting rights, those things in my mind are I have no qualms about voting for those. But whereas we imagine that our elected officials are making black and white decisions every day, most of them are actually navigating a gray area. And one that I point to in this book is post-traumatic stress for EMTs. We talk a lot in this country, and deservedly so, about those who serve our country abroad and come home and experience trauma that stays with them. It impacts their personal and professional life. They suffer from post-traumatic stress, and we provide, hopefully, or we try to provide the resources they need. What we don't talk nearly enough about is the post-traumatic stress that the folks in our community in uniform experience. I'm thinking police officers, EMTs, firefighters, 911 dispatchers, Department of Corrections workers. They experience trauma every day. While the rest of us run away from a problem, they run towards it. Yep. And a lot of that trauma stays with them after their shift ends. Long story long. I was in Westport on Memorial Day Parade in 2019, and happened to be marching next to the EMT crew. And they told me about this problem, that many of them had suffered from post-traumatic stress. Some of them had actually run into Sandy Hook and seen firsthand the tragedy, the aftermath of that tragedy. And they asked that I work to expand protections to their profession. A few months later, we get to Hartford, the bill lands on my desk, and as we're about to vote on it, with about 5 minutes to spare, it covers firefighters and it covers police officers, but it doesn't cover EMTs.
You wanted it to cover EMTs.
And I did, and it was one of those moments where to vote no would be wrong, because surely police officers and firefighters deserve that protection, but to vote yes would be wrong, because then it excludes the very folks I had promised to fight for. There was no right way to vote. I stepped out into the hall, I called one of those EMT workers who I'd marched with, and he was, after some, heavy sighs and a few complaints, he was nice enough to say that, I should vote for the bill and fight to extend it to EMTs in the future. That's what I did, and the next year we extended it to EMTs. But it didn't feel great. It didn't feel, glorious. We didn't pat ourselves on the back. It was one of many gray areas that you have to navigate.
It's one of those ideas that also resonates along the lines of individual conversation. If we break the polarization in many respects, when you are actually talking one-on-one, don't you think? Hasn't that happened to you?
Totally. My favorite thing to do. I get a lot of angry emails. It was something I was totally unprepared for in this job. I grew up not knowing who my state senator was. Yeah. So I didn't know.
You hadn't even been to Hartford.
I've never been to the state capitol,
right?
Yeah. Speaking of honesty, this book, I I disclosed that I was totally not checked into state politics until Donald Trump won, and I decided to take a close look at who my voice was at the state level. Anyways, I wasn't fully prepared for how many people reach out in an angry way to their state senator, and it's hundreds every day. And my favorite thing to do is to pick up the phone. I can't call them all back, but I call those who are the most angry, because usually I've got a lot of time driving to and from Hartford, and usually over the course of those phone calls, we learn a little bit more about each other. We don't always walk away agreeing with one another, but we do. They usually don't send another angry email, at least not with the same sort of vitriol.
That's encouraging.
Yeah.
Yeah, you make an observation a couple different times in the book about millennials and Zoomers, and that they come to the voting booth with very different priorities in your mind. Tell us a little bit about that.
I think they do. I think that pundits who talk about young voters on TV all the time usually get it wrong, because they group these two generations, Gen Z and millennials, into one category. Millennials are cynical. 19% believe that, generally speaking, people can be trusted. I'm going to repeat that because it blows my mind every time I say it. Less than 1 in 5 millennials think that, generally speaking, people can be trusted.
And the headline is, millennials are cynical.
Yeah.
Right? That's interesting.
I do. I mean, that number for boomers is closer to 50%. So millennials are a generation that, probably for a whole host of well-founded reasons, growing up during the forever wars of the Bush era, participating in school shooter drills, watching the rise of a reality TV star to the Oval Office, spending many of their formative years indoors because a virus caused the worst recession since the Great Depression. I mean, for a host of reasons, I can understand why millennials are cynical. But Gen Z is not. Whether it's Greta Thunberg leading a global strike for climate change, whether it's Emma Gonzalez walking out of school to demand stronger gun laws, Gen Z, they're not only optimistic about politics, but they're incredibly engaged in public service. Sometimes that's as an activist. Increasingly, they're getting their names on the ballot. But the most important takeaway, and the one that's probably the most empirical, is they're showing up to vote in record numbers.
But why wouldn't young people be as polarized as an older generation?
I think they've reached a breaking point. We're a generation that knows that climate change...
But doesn't every generation feel like they've reached a breaking point?
I don't know. I think we really are. For us, climate change isn't just something we can learn about in class. It's going to pose an existential threat to our ability to lead healthy and happy lives.
And you also make mention of the fact that the tragedy at Sandy Hook instills a different kind of approach to your whole generation.
Yeah, we know what it's like to hear that loud noise in the hallway and worry about where we would hide if the next school shooting came to our community. We know that economists say we're the first generation that's going to be financially worse off than our parents in American history. If the cost of college continues to increase in the way that it has, we're not going to be even able to afford to send our own kids to the schools that we went to. So I do think that Gen Z has a lot of reasons to be involved in politics, but one thing that stunned and excited me about my tiny corner of my tiny state is how involved they got in down-ballot races. I talked about the interns who made a huge difference in our campaign, but even standing at the polls on Election Day in 2018 and in 2020, we met so many 18-year-olds who were casting their vote for the very first time. 55% of people between the age of 18 and 29 voted in the 2020 election, and that's a 10-point increase from 2016. So if there's one takeaway from this book, I hope it's that it makes people feel optimistic, that there's a next generation stepping off of the sidelines, and while everybody else is throwing up their hands, they're rolling up their sleeves.
I got the impression from the book that state politics might not be quite as polarized as federal politics, and we certainly all are just weary beyond words of the polarization in the country. Is that true, first of all? Is state politics a little less polarized?
It is. 80% of the bills that we pass in the Senate are bipartisan. Not entirely. There's one senator who relishes his reputation, is voting no on everything. Yeah. But 80% have at least some Republican support, and I think that should make us all feel a little bit optimistic.
Is there an equivalent to the filibuster in state politics?
Yeah, we actually do filibuster. That's the irony. Washington just talks about a filibuster, but you almost never see a senator standing on the floor for 16 hours, but that happens all the time in Hartford. I thought that I was done with all-nighters when I graduated from college, but I pulled way more all-nighters in this job.
I bet.
Regularly, our Republican colleagues will decide that they want to discourage us from passing minimum wage increases or paid family leave or the free community college bill that I worked on by talking for 16, 17, 18 hours straight. And the rule in Hartford is they actually have to be standing and talking. They can't read emails. They can't read recipes from a cookbook. They actually have to talk about the bill. So it can lead to some fun moments.
Were you engaged in a filibuster?
No, filibuster is a tool used by the minority party, and the state senate when I ran was tied, 18 Democrats, 18 Republicans, but now we have a strong Democratic majority.
Was there a time that you just got sort of overwhelmed? I forget the quote exactly, but you said, being in state politics, there were moments when I actually felt sane. Was there an insane moment?
That's a hard question. Yeah, plenty of them. I tell the story in the book about walking around Ridgefield one time, and an older constituent said, oh, you were recently elected to Hartford. Where have you been? And I said, Hartford. She said, well, we didn't elect you to pass laws. We elected you to be seen in and around the community. And a part of the job, sure, is to go to Eagle Scout ceremonies and retirement parties and anything that somebody invites you to in the district. But the other part of the job, the substantive part of the job, is to spend a lot of time in Hartford negotiating with your colleagues, withstanding those filibusters, passing bills. And I go insane a little bit by trying to connect Fairfield County with Hartford. It's not that far away. I do the drive almost every day, but it feels worlds away. It's different media markets. Sometimes when you knock on doors in Westport and you talk about the governor, they think you're talking about Hochul or Cuomo, right? I mean,
Yeah.
So it can be really hard to bring back the news about what we're working on in Hartford back to Westport or back to Ridgefield. I remember when we passed paid family and medical leave, the most inclusive and the most generous paid leave program in the entire country. It was like earth-shattering in Hartford. We passed it just in time for the Hartford Courant to put it on their front page. We stayed up all night. It felt like a big deal. And then weeks later, I was walking around my community, and a constituent, no fault of her own, there's no local newspaper in the town where she lives, she tapped me on the shoulder and said, when are you guys going to get around to passing paid family and medical leave? And it was totally eye-opening for me that unless we talk about the work that we're doing, nobody's going to hear about it.
It brings to mind one of the chapter heads for your book was that don't call Mitch McConnell, call your state senator. What do you mean by that exactly?
I, every day, go on Instagram, and one of my Democratic friends will tell me in their Instagram story that I should call Joe Biden, or call Mitch McConnell, or call Joe Manchin. And I promise you I'm not going to reach them. And if I spend a polite 5 minutes speaking with their intern, I don't think it's going to change what happens to the Build Back Better plan. That being said, if you pick up your phone and you call your state senator, you're going to get me on my cell phone. And if 10 people pick up the phone and call me and ask me to focus on a particular bill that matters to them, it's going to change the course of my day. I'm going to become incredibly focused on that bill. So, and I've seen firsthand, when we were passing a tax credit for student loan repayment, a handful of realtors in every community picked up the phone and called their state representative. And all of a sudden, a bill that was nowhere close to getting across the finish line made it to the governor's desk the next day. Not enough people decide to engage on that level. And I'm not judging anybody. Like I said, I didn't know who my state senator was before I ran. But if we decide as a community and as a country to dedicate just a small portion of the activism that we send towards Washington, towards our state legislature, I think that we're going to start to see transformative changes in our community, changes that we desperately want.
You're still so full of optimism, aren't you? It's amazing. It's great. I mean, I have a hard time getting out of bed sometimes after I've looked at the news. Is your optimism, is it youth-born, or is it politically born, or both?
I think I ran because I was feeling pessimistic about the state of our politics. I was, like a lot of young people, had grown up sort of lulled by this progressive inevitability that consumed the Obama years. And then President Trump's election, it felt like a punch in the gut. Suddenly there was a president saying that explicitly he was going to go backwards. He was going to make America great again. So when President Obama said in his farewell address, if you're disappointed in your elected officials, grab a clipboard, get some signatures, and run for office yourself, I took it literally, and I did it. And that was my peak. Yeah, there's my clipboard.
Get running.
And that was the peak moment of pessimism for me. Since that time, I only have reasons to feel optimistic. I've seen now firsthand that underdog candidates still have a chance. I've seen that after you're elected, you're very much accountable to the people that you represent. I've seen that politics, by and large, is filled with ordinary people who are just trying to make their community a little bit better. There's some real structural reforms that are needed, but every once in a while, we get to pass a bill that changes the lives of the folks we represent. So this call, in addition to sharing my optimism about politics, I'm begging and pleading other people who are feeling frustrated or pessimistic to do the same thing, to run for office, whether it's for the state senate or for the Board of Ed or for Congress. I think that we need more unlikely candidates, people who never saw themselves as somebody who could be on the ballot. Those are exactly the voices that we need.
So if there's a college student out there, a law school student, a young worker anywhere in the district who's listening to you right now, best advice, best practical advice, if they're feeling, maybe I want to do this, or the first step, what is it?
Hire your college roommate as your campaign manager, and ask your girlfriend's mom to be your treasurer.
That's good.
But no, in all seriousness,
That's what you did, right?
that's what I did, and I guess my advice to them would be recognize that your youth is not a liability, but instead an asset. I was so nervous to talk about my age. I was 21, but I looked 12, and I would knock on people's doors, and they would immediately want to know how old I was. And I always tried to change the subject. You know, I'm 21 years old.
You look 18 now to me.
Yeah. The job has aged me in that way, I think. But, I would say, well, I'm 21, but here's my plan to speed up the trains. Here's my plan to address our pension crisis. And that wasn't doing it, right? People still wanted to talk about my age. And what I came to realize is that actually, I shouldn't shy away from this. I should embrace it as a part of my reason for running. Every day, policymakers, whether it's at town hall or at the state capitol or in Congress, decide what the next 20, 50, 100 years of American life will look like. And they're doing so without any stakeholders in the future, without any of tomorrow's taxpayers, without any of the people who are going to have to live out the consequences of those decisions. So I started to tell my story about coming back to Connecticut, how we need to draw more young people to Connecticut, how we can make investments that make this place more exciting for 20-somethings and 30-somethings who want to start a career, start a family, start a small business. And by explicitly talking about my age, I found that we gained a lot more traction, both among young people who were excited to recognize themselves and their values in someone on the ballot, but frankly, and as importantly, in a whole bunch of folks from my grandparents' generation who believed in President Kennedy's long overdue promise about passing the baton to the next generation.
Yeah. John Kennedy's inaugural speech was my first feeling like, God, politics is interesting. I was, 8 years old or something. But those things can spark a flame that stays lit your whole life.
Yeah.
Listening this afternoon to just a brief portion of Justice Breyer's formal resignation. He was fantastic. He was so optimistic. 83-year-old justice. He was remarkably optimistic, and one of the things that he was most optimistic about, or the reason for it, was he said high school kids, college kids, young people. Mm-hmm. And so you're following the right path, I think.
I feel more optimistic. I'm walking out of this job incredibly sad to be leaving, but feeling way more optimistic than I was when I walked into the Capitol building, that's for sure.
When you decided to run and after your election, the message you often say in the book is that the message was a very positive one for other young people to do the same thing. Are you concerned at all that you're sending the wrong message by saying, I got out after two terms, I'm not going to do it anymore?
That is kind of a paradox in the book, isn't it? No, here's why I don't think so. I ran because, first and foremost, I thought it was, as Bill said, I thought it was time for a change. The government works best when new voices get to enter the caucus room or the committee hearing or the Senate floor, and they shake up the status quo. So whoever fills my seat next, they're guaranteed to bring new ideas, and probably, almost certainly, a lot of those ideas will be much better. So I thought the change was good then, and I think the change is good now. It's healthy for Connecticut and healthy for the 26th district. I mentioned that honesty was the goal of this book. When I beg and plead with other young people to consider running for office, I don't mean to tell them that they have to put on hold everything else that they care about, whether it's the people that they love or the professions that they hope to pursue or the cities they want to live in. I think that it's okay that we normalize politics as something that you go into when you want to see change and you accomplish some change maybe, and then you step back and go back to all of the other things that interest you. And maybe you jump back in later. I would love to find my way back into politics later on if possible, but it doesn't always have to be in preparation for this book, I read a lot of books by other politicians, and they all seem to say that if you're going to go into politics, you have to turn your life over to it completely, and it has to define who you are. And I think we're going to get a very narrow population of people who are willing to serve, if that's the case.
Did you feel worn out at all at the end of their terms?
Yeah, the drive homes were tough, because you get out of a filibuster at 4 in the morning, and the sun is rising as you drive home. And you have an Eagle Scout
getting down
ceremony.
into the weeds of the politics all the time. I sense from the end of the book that there was a sort of a weariness in a way.
The weeds were the most exciting part, actually. That's where the lawmaking happens, right? The people say the devil's in the details, but that's the joy of the job. What I think is challenging is, raising money every 2 years. Yeah. We have it pretty great in Connecticut. We have a publicly financed election system. It's the only way that I could have afforded to run for office. For those who aren't familiar, it puts a 22-year-old on an equal playing field with somebody who's been at the Capitol for 22 years. You both have an equal amount of money, and you can't spend a cent more. If we had that across the country, you'd see more women, more people of color, more young people, more working class people running for office. So I don't really mean to complain, but if there's one thing that did wear me down about the job or that I didn't like doing, it was asking for money.
Yeah, I bet. You make the observation, too, about, and you've spoken about sort of one-on-one being a crucial part of why you got into politics, and I think why you're probably very effective at it in any level. You say that during the pandemic, you found your most satisfying moments helping your constituents through this incredible pandemic and the COVID years. In many respects, that was even more satisfying than the work in Hartford. Talk about that.
Yeah, an aspect of this job for which, one of many aspects for this job for which I wasn't prepared was the constituent services. You run because you care about a handful of legislative issues, and you work on those for about 6 months a year during the legislative session. Well, what does a state senator do for the other 6 months a year? It's largely be an advocate within the state bureaucracy for the people that you represent. And sometimes it's small issues. Somebody's having trouble getting a fishing license or a license renewed, but sometimes those issues are life-changing. Somebody is having trouble with their insurance company. Somebody's having trouble getting in contact with a loved one who's behind bars. All sorts of issues cross our desk every day that aren't at all political. It doesn't matter who they voted for, but it's our job to be their voice within the state government and to shake some trees and try to get answers. And nowhere was that more important than during the pandemic. Normally, in a district of about 100,000 people, I hear from the same 10,000 usually, right? All of a sudden, we were hearing from folks who had never knew they had a state senator, never reached out to the government for help before, but they needed PPE, they needed PPP, they needed plexiglass and masks and unemployment checks and testing, and eventually they needed a vaccine. And our campaign operation transitioned because it didn't feel appropriate to ask people for votes towards full-time responding to these needs. We had the interns drop what they were doing, no more asking people if they were going to show up on election day, no more asking people for donations. We had them calling seniors, making sure that they had vaccine appointments. That was really satisfying work, and it felt better than any of the other political stuff, frankly.
I bet. If you had to look back over the 4 years, there's high points and low points. Give me your greatest achievement so far in this career of yours.
Well, I talk a lot in the book about the things that we didn't get across the finish line. So
Transportation was one.
yeah, tolls, still haven't passed tolls. Still trying to join every other state on the East Coast and asking out-of-state drivers and trucking companies to contribute. But the thing that I am the most proud of passing is a free community college program. Couldn't have done it alone. A lot of help in the Senate, a lot of help from Governor Lamont and others. But as Bill mentioned, it's tremendously satisfying getting to know some of the students who now are able to pursue a degree on their community college campus who wouldn't have otherwise been able to. And there's 7,000 of them now out there in Connecticut who have participated in that program. And it's so great for them and for their families, but it's really good for Connecticut too, because 70% of jobs in this state are going to require some degree beyond a high school diploma by 2025. And 2025 is around the corner, but we're nowhere near meeting that workforce goal. We need 300,000 more graduates a year. So anything we can do to tear down the barrier of affordability and make it possible for people to make its economic future.
Both economic and otherwise, three priorities for you. You talk about putting young people at a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. If they were pulling up their seat tonight, what would you want their top priorities to be?
Well, I'd want to ask them. One thing that I take seriously when I spoke to a bunch of high school students today. I accept every invitation to speak to students that I get. And whereas a lot of politicians talk about young people, I think that we need more politicians who talk to them. No more photo ops in classrooms if you're not willing to spearhead something that's actually going to help the students. So I'd be curious what they would say, but from my canvassing over the last 3-4 years of what young people care about, they want to see gun violence prevention. They want to see bold action on climate change. They're worried about being able to afford a college degree. And I would say finally that their perspective, a lot of people might feel unprepared to draft legislation. I had this feeling from afar that our laws were written by PhDs who knew everything about everything, and that's not the case at all. It's true, a young person who has a seat at the table might not know what it's like to start a small business or to deal with the declining health of their elderly parents or to take out a mortgage, but they might know what it's like to afford rent. I'm the only renter in the Senate, but there are 40% of Connecticut households that are rented. Surely those folks deserve a voice and deserve representation too. I became the Senate chairman of the Higher Education Committee, not because I was an expert on any higher education matters, but because I'd been on campus recently. And when we talked about issues like consent, I had seen on Friday nights and Saturday nights what consent can look like, and tragically what it sometimes doesn't look like on college campuses. So I think no matter what issue they bring to the table, young people might feel inexperienced, but recognize that it's just a different kind of experience that they have.
The future of American democracy. Fill in the line at the end of that.
It's in
trouble. The future of American democracy is.
It's in huge, huge trouble. Democracy is better. I guess that sounds pessimistic, but we should all agree, Democrats and Republicans, that our country and our democracy is better when more people participate in elections, not fewer. But thanks, right?
So you must be disappointed with all the closed doors on voting rights bills in Washington.
Yeah, and I'm also disappointed because I think a lot of our activism and frustration is directed towards southern states like Georgia, and rightfully so. What they're doing is reprehensible. But what they're doing is reducing the number of early voting days that we have in Connecticut. I'm sorry, or the number of early voting days that they have in Georgia. In Connecticut, we don't have any early voting days. So let's not give blue states a pass, right? Let's recognize that we in Connecticut, while we're condemning what the Georgia legislature is doing, have some of the most antiquated, backwards, and inaccessible elections in the country. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done to fix that. It makes our democracy smaller and less inclusive and therefore less functional.
And on that very positive note, we should open things up to the crowd here. We have questions from all of our visitors? Anyone have a question for the senator? Sure.
If for those of you in the library, if you could come to one of the microphones that are on either side of the
So
forum
just
today.
wander over to a microphone if you
Thank
have any
you.
kind of question at all.
This is a congratulations, because at the beginning of the book, you were really panning Tony Boucher. But towards the end of the book, you came to realize what she was dealing with. And I don't agree with anything, Tony stands for politically. But it was really showing your character, that you could be conciliatory and understand what your opponent was going through. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Celeste. Yeah, I have regrets about our 2018. It was never personal. My predecessor is a wonderful person, and I said that then, and I say that now. But we were too black and white in our criticism of her voting record. And when I arrived in the Senate, like I said, I realized that most issues fall somewhere in the middle, and there's a lot of gray area. We had substantive policy disagreements, but we should have acknowledged the nuance, I think, in that campaign a little bit more.
Have you talked to her about it personally?
I haven't.
Let's give her a call.
She's on the line.
She's not.
Actually, I have some questions from people who are on the line.
Oh, okay, good, great. Some of the folks who are watching streaming.
Yeah, exactly. How did the policy-making role in the state Senate differ from what you anticipated working on? Were the big issues during your 2 terms what you expected? What was more controversial and what was less?
That's a fun question. So, like I said, you run for office because you care about 3, 4, or 5 issues that really motivate you and motivate your community. And then you get to the Senate, weirdest onboarding process of all time, by the way, right? It's sort of like college. You get your ID and you get your desk and you learn where the bathroom is, but also you're responsible to answering 100,000 for, speaking for 100,000 people. And yeah, the majority had voted to send me there, but only by a little bit. There were still tens of thousands of people who thought I wasn't up for the job, and I wasn't sure that they were wrong. So when I got there, you're assigned to 6 or 7 committees, and the way the legislature works makes no sense. It's as though you're going to school, but a deranged guidance counselor has scheduled all your classes at the same time. So, you're sitting in the transportation committee fighting about tolls, and that's something you really care about, but at the same time, the Judiciary Committee is voting on banning ghost guns. So you're listening to that on your computer. And then in your ear, you've got your iPhone playing because the Environment Committee is considering banning plastic bags.
Oh my God.
You can't possibly read every bill before you, let alone participate in all the meetings in which you're supposedly present. So just trying to keep up in this job is really hard. And that's not a complaint as much to say that elected officials just have to do a better job of listening than talking. And as long as you're ready to listen, I think you can figure out how you're going to vote by the time it reaches the Senate floor. So I guess what I learned about the process is that, like I said before, I thought that everybody knew everything about every bill when they were going to vote on it. And in fact, you run on 7 issues and you're asked to vote on, I think we passed 491 laws in my first session. So you have to develop a rather informed opinion on a whole host of issues really quickly. And in order to do that, you can't give long speeches or you can't be filibustering. You have to spend as much time as you can listening. That's something that I learned in my first session.
Is there another question? No.
There are several, actually. And if anybody here in the building wants to jump up at any time, I'm fine moving. So are you looking to find us a replacement who will carry on with your initiatives?
There are a few Democrats running.
A few of them are in the audience, I believe.
That's true. I think a few of them are here. Ken is here, I know. I'm not going to get involved in the Democratic primary, but I am very committed to making sure that the seat stays blue, and I'll be knocking just as many doors for that candidate as I did for myself, that's for sure.
Okay. And do you intend to run any time in the future?
No,
This is going to be a perpetual question for you, right? Tell me.
I got the whole process wrong, right? Most people write a book and run for office. Or most people go to law school, write a book, and run for office. I ran for office and going to law school, and I wrote a book as I'm leaving. So I get that that's a little bit strange, but I don't have any plans to run in the immediate future. I'm stepping back from politics, but that doesn't mean I'm stepping away from public service. I want to use my law degree to help people. I've found one outlet in elected office that's really rewarding and really fun, but perhaps I could find another outlet as well. And maybe down the road, if the right opportunity opens up, if there's another incumbent who ought to be challenged, who, you know.
There are so many.
Yeah, then maybe. I'm not closing doors to the future, but no, I don't have my eye on any other office at the moment. I'm excited to step back and pursue public service in a different way.
Now, be honest, would you ever consider running for president?
Never been asked that. I have no idea. You'd have to talk to Katie. I'm gonna punt on that one.
No, I'm talking to you. Seriously, you think about that ever? It must cross your mind at some point. You've been in state politics at the gut level. You've learned to campaign. You broke down a lot of barriers. You surprised a lot of people. Do you think you could do it at the federal level?
One of many reasons why it would be totally different and is hard for me to imagine doing is that you really can have those interpersonal relationships with constituents, not nearly at the same level. I had 147 town halls as a state senator, and I got to know a lot of the people I represent. You can't do that if you represent a whole state. You certainly can't do it if you represent a whole country. And I can't imagine doing this job being more disconnected from the people. As it was, I found it stressful that I couldn't call everybody back. Right. So I don't mean to avoid your question, but it's entirely outside of the realm of something I could imagine, because my experience in politics is all about trying to learn from the folks I represent, get their ideas before session. By the way, a quick plug, I'm in this job for another year, and we're up, legislative session starts in 2 weeks. So for folks who do want to see bills become law, please reach out and let me know. You know, every year I hear from a handful of constituents who say, hey, well, I'll give you the greatest example. A high school student in Wilton said, I want to continue to see my therapist. My therapist agrees that I shouldn't tell my parents. I've been seeing him or her confidentially. And state law in Connecticut says that after 6 sessions, I have to disclose that I'm receiving that care. There's no protection for the confidentiality of minors. And he said, I'm worried for myself, and frankly, I'm worried for my peers, many of whom are struggling with mental health. I was not aware of the 6-session cap. You know, like I said, we focused on a few issues. It's never something that had crossed my desk before.
What age were we talking about? How old is it?
If you're under 18. The person reaching out to me, I think, was 17. Yeah. Amazing, an inspiring high school student. Anyways, he brought my attention to this issue. We drafted a bill. It became Senate Bill 2 last year, and it was signed by the governor about 11 months ago. And now in Connecticut, there's no cap on the number of confidential sessions. And it's never something I would have known about if a constituent hadn't told me. So please be in touch. Let me know how I can help you. And that's the part of the job I like most. And in higher office, it's really hard to have those kind of conversations.
You don't hear that from a politician that often. Right? Please be in touch. Get off as often as you can. Was there another question?
Yep. So this next question actually touches on that as well. In your book, you talk about working very hard, twisting yourself into contortions to please 100,000 constituents. And you said tonight, you mentioned part of your optimism is seeing politicians who are accountable to people they represent. Yet in Washington, so many politicians have abandoned their constituents. How do we get more politicians to refocus on their own bosses?
Public finance reform. Connecticut is one of only 6 states in the country that has publicly financed elections. And I complained about raising money, but I'll be totally honest. I had to raise $15,000 from 300 people. That's doable. Jack and I did it over the course of our spring break. And after that, we never had to ask for another check. We could start asking people for votes. And that's how it should be at every level. Unfortunately, our system creates a world in which U.S. senators are very accountable to large industries in their state, to lobbyists, to wealthy people have a disproportionate advantage because they can pour, as somebody just did who's running for governor in Connecticut, $10 million of his own money into his campaign coffers. So long as the system remains sort of outside in the Wild West, outside of regulation, we're not going to see democracy come close to being representative. We're not going to see other young people, folks who have 9-to-5 jobs or minimum wage jobs. We're not going to see working women with children. We're not going to see we're not going to see people of color running for office at the rates that they should be because the world is closed off to them. So Connecticut is screwed up in a lot of ways. We have a legislature that doesn't pay nearly enough. We have a legislature that tries to get done in 6 months what other states accomplish in 12 months. But the one thing that we get right is publicly financed elections, and I think it would fundamentally change how politics works in this country if other states followed Connecticut's lead.
Okay, the last question for this evening. Who is your political role model?
That's a really fun question. I've got a lot of role models, some in Connecticut, but it'd be tough to pick one in Connecticut because I would then offend 34 other senators.
Well, start with one.
Okay, here's one who I talk about in the book. I had the chance. State senators are not full-time. It's not a full-time job. At least it wasn't designed to be by the framers of Connecticut's legislature. So we get paid $28,000 a year. It's very hard, impossible, I would say, to afford rent in my district on $28,000 a year. So some people have outside jobs. Some people have outside jobs. Some people have wealthy spouses or a huge bank account themselves. Many who have outside jobs, it leads to either conflicts of interest or the appearance of a conflict of interest. A handful of my colleagues work for Eversource, a company that we're responsible for regulating. So I often say something very unpopular, which is that we should pay politicians more, but it's not that I think anybody in this job should get rich. I just think that if we pay them a wage where they can afford to pay their rent or buy a home or put food on the table and pay their bills without seeking outside employment, we'd have a legislature that's filled with fewer, wealthy, retired individuals, which, they bring a lot of perspective, but they shouldn't be overrepresented in the legislature, and fewer people seeking outside employment. Anyways, this is a roundabout way of saying I sought outside employment that I hoped would have no conflict of interest, and so far that's borne out, and it is with the office of Congressman Jim Himes. So for the last 3 years, I've had a chance to work with Jim up close and personal. And what I really admire about his approach to politics is he works hard as hard as anybody. He gets really into the legislative details, but when he's also able to check out and be a normal person. He has hobbies. He makes honey and brews beer and spends time with his family. And I think I grew up watching The West Wing, and I love The West Wing, but I think Aaron Sorkin instills in us this idea that politicians have to be exceptional, that they have to juggle multiple games of chess and an international crisis and be, Nobel laureates and all of these things. And Fox News has us believe that politicians are evil and that Nancy Pelosi eats children for breakfast every morning. And the reality is somewhere in between. Politicians can and should be, I think, ordinary people. And Jim's a smart guy and he works really hard, but he sort of embraces the sides of him that are apolitical and doesn't lose himself in his job. That's something that I really admire.
And I think that you embody that in so many respects.
Thank you. I try to, but truth be told, I don't do nearly as good a job as he does.
Well, keep working on it. Very good. Thank you so much. It was a joy talking to you.
Thank you.
Is there anything that you'd like to leave the audience with? Any idea?
Well, just to say, it's such a joy to be here. I have so many great memories as a kid of being at the Westport Library, and it feels so special to return here tonight. And to the folks watching online and to the people who are here, thank you so much for coming. And I see so many familiar faces here tonight. Thank you for having my back every step of this journey. It's been a real honor to serve this town.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Jay. This is so fun.
And thank you, Jay and Will. For those of you who are here, we do have copies of this book for sale. Will has already signed them, but I think he may personalize. I'm not sure. I'm not promising. But we do have copies of the book. And this event will be recorded and posted on our website so you can share it with all your friends.